So we're back with um, Worlds Beyond Time. Yesterday, we basically just covered the introduction along with the other stuff we looked at. So today we're starting with the abstract, surreal, and otherworldly. At the dawn of the 50s, printed science fiction stories appeared almost exclusively in magazines, but by the end of the decade, mass-produced paperbacks had taken over as the preeminent sci-fi source. Back in 1935, Penguin Books had developed the revolutionary paperback, but science fiction publishing in this format was sporadic until 1952, when Ace Books launched its Double series, and Ian and Betty Ballantine founded Ballantine Books. The Ballantine power couple brought Penguin Books to the US in 1939, after which Ian was pushed out of Penguin, in part for putting illustrations on paperback covers so lurid. Ballantine Books was their chance to prove their philosophy, that a lot more people would read books if books were more accessible. Paperbacks cost $0.25 and were at every drugstore, so they fit the bill. And in addition to the typical mysteries, westerns, and war stories, Ballantine Books published nonconformist humor books, proto-true crime, and above all, science fiction. The Ballantines would need a bold, memorable marketing approach for their fledgling line of sci-fi paperbacks, and they found one in artist Richard M. Powers. His trippy, abstracted covers pulled directly from the surrealist movement. And on the cover of 1953's Ballantine debut of Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End, he launched the non-representational style that would go on to defy sci-fi paperbacks across the 60s. But surrealist covers could be composed from representational elements. Don Ivan Punchat's high-concept, often intentionally primitive style, and Ron Wolotsky's brightly lit, fantastical scenes are examples. And in Paul Lair's landscapes, elements of surrealism could be woven into relatively representational work. Whatever the case, it permeated culture. Publishers settled on regular artists. Avon worked with Punchat, Signet, and later Ballantine. And Bob Pepper. Ace Books' upscale science fiction specials line had Leo and Diane Dillon. Penguin went straight to the source for its sci-fi novels, skipping commercial illustrators in favor of reprinting fine art surrealism pioneers, including Wassily Kandinsky and Max Ernst. The surrealism trend dovetailed well with the darker, challenging work of the new wave science fiction authors, as well as the psychedelia and pop art collages of 60s culture in general. One noted surrealists like Bob Pepper continued strong in the 70s and 80s. Here's a representative work, his decorative 1974 cover for The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World by Harlan Ellison. 2. This 1953 Richard M. Powers cover for Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End was a breakout hit and kicked off the surrealism trend. But it had also pulled in older hard science fiction that wasn't such an obvious fit. Manifesting a line of abstracted tie-dye covers by Jean Safran for Ace's 1970 reprints of novels by Robert A. Heinlein, one of the least tie-dyed sci-fi authors imaginable. Jack Gaughan, who had worked in representational pulp magazine illustrations since the late 40s, began adding surrealistic elements to his covers. He would later explain that his early 70s purchase of a pair of reading glasses ushered me out of my impressionistic period. For a moment in time, surreal sci-fi covers were everywhere. It was too weird to last. In the late 60s, flagging sci-fi sales and the growth of the larger paperback industry led to the changing of the guard. Experimental art directors began to cede creative control to publishers and editors. That shift can be pinned to a year, it's 1971, when Donald A. Wolfheim left Ace Books to start Daw Books, and Lester and Judy Lynn Del Rey started the Del Rey imprint within Ballantine. They both pushed for bright covers and heavily narrative art of spaceships or landscapes. Was that binary decision correct? Are clear-cut tropes easy to sell, while surrealism was confusingly modernistic? Likely not. Science fiction artist and art historian Vincent D. Fate calls Wolfheim and Del Rey not artistically sophisticated when it comes to covers, and he suspects that somber colors and unsettling imagery were behind the dip in sales rather than surrealism itself. Surrealism remained popular in many European countries. Dutch-Italian painter Karel Fols, 4 decades of surreal covers to Italian magazine Urania, began in 1960, while Wojciech Sudmak and Horatio Salinas Blanche kept France and Spain in surrealist covers across the 70s and 80s. The art hadn't completely vanished in the US and UK either, as established surrealists kept finding work in science fiction, and a few new ones broke in, like Joe Patagno and Davis Meltzer. Although the 70s and 80s science fiction moved on, it didn't forget the past. The colorful machinery and vistas in this book owe a debt to the 60s boundary-breaking excursion into surrealism. 3. No artist has been credited for this 1976 cover art for Mindbridge by Joel Haldeman. It's an example of compositional surrealism, a torso with a moon head, and stands out for its simplicity. Jack Gaughan, 4. Jack Gaughan started with fanzines in the late 40s, and while he adapted to the 60s surrealism trend, he seems to have preferred more representational work, particularly after an early 70s realization that he had needed reading glasses for years. This groovy February 1970 cover for Galaxy magazine is one of his purest surrealist works. Some sci-fi titles simply demanded an outside-the-box cover, like Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space, about a malevolent color that can't be described and drives people insane. Imagine spending your whole career working within the confines of a traditional color palette, and then getting told you need to invent an extraterrestrial one. I'd quit. Instead, Victor Vala's 1971 cover went with a garish rainbow on a moth-like alien. If you can't represent one color, just mash up a handful of them so that the end result is tough to look at directly. It's a typical trippy surrealism era solution, in sharp contrast to some modern cover artists' much more buttoned up answer, black and white. Two, Vala contributed a similar cover for another Lovecraft anthology that same year with this 1971 cover for the Dunwich Horror. This time the shimmering monster has ram's horns and the title text is an impressive hot pink. As the class artist of Chicago's top Catholic high school, Richard M. Powers was suspect number one when the teachers discovered amateur pornography scribbled in the math books. His exonerating defense: the composition was terrible, he couldn't be associated with it, and he'd be happy to produce a better sample to prove as such. Two of Powers' lifelong traits are embodied in this anecdote. First, he was a legendary artist. Second, he was a huge wise ass. A. Powers' cover is complex and non-representational, evoking the ideas of the story within but challenging the viewer to interpret it. Nebulous blobby amoebae called to mind biological life. Angular spikes and spires involve mechanical threats. Popular motifs include skulls, weird swirls, and an abundance of shadowy figures, whether alone or clustered in a trudging horde, and foreboding faces seep in from the edges of his works, like he couldn't keep himself from packing in a little more unconscious mind imagery at the last second. Elected to the Society of Illustrators in 1958, Powers submitted a bio referring to himself as a card-carrying member, Flat Earth Association. Among other absurdities, and as his profile expanded throughout the 60s, his chaotic sense of humor got weirder. He invented an art collective to satirize the pop art movement, signing some commission covers Laz/org rather than his own name. His own sci-fi world, Flower, was another creation represented by a seemingly arbitrary number of his own works. All but 3 were initially unrelated cover commissions. He published a Flower portfolio replete with intentionally pretentious commentary designed to mock the formality of art assessment. It's not an alternate reality painting, it's a mythopoeic adumbration. It's retinal therapy. It's Gog Flar, Cross Park of Flar, Gog of Magog. By the 80s, Powers was getting less and less work. He had produced a hearty 1,400 commercial illustrations across his career, and it's tough to overstate his infectious impact. But his covers had been so definitive for so long that they had dated themselves. His radically abstract, wait, we can do that, take on sci-fi covers shook up the genre, catching the eye of the next generation. His work sparked Michael Moorcock's interest in sci-fi and directly influenced more representational artists like Paul Lair, John Schoenherr, and a mid-career Jack Gaughan. One on the left page. Powers' 1969 cover for Moons of Trappist by John Rankine is the ideal groovy paperback cover. 2. A 1959 cover for Leo Margaile's anthology 3 from Out There, featuring a blend of Powers' faves, the organic, mechanic, and a warped figure observing it. These mannequin figures are big in surrealism, representing uncanny biomorphic images from the subconscious. 3. This 1980 cover for Heinlein's The The Number of the Beast, exemplifies the layers of unconscious imagery Powers packs in. You probably noticed the representational spaceship and the surreal giant contemplative satanic face, but did you spot the abstract 666 number hanging out in the background? The unsettling Don Ivan Punchats. While Punchats had the range to produce photorealistic art, his best covers employ his homebrewed style, neo-primitive surrealist. The details are smooth and minimal, yet the composition is complex. The end result is always engaging and frequently disturbing. The idea someone's face split open even once is horrific, let alone 3 times, as they're playing a centipede snake-like saxophone. Punchats used acrylics and knew how to direct the eye with vibrant colors. The bright orange plumes of volcanic smoke in the background as his 1970 cover for Robert Silverberg's Hawksbill Station are an early example. Punchats had an enviable career outside of sci-fi covers. Between launching his own art studio in '69 and his retirement in the '90s, he created art for such quintessentially American institutions as Time, National Geographic, National Lampoon, Exxon, and the influential '90s first-person shooter, Doom. 1. Punchats' 1974 cover art for the supernatural horror collection, Night's Yawning Peel, edited by August Derleth, is an example of how his style spanned the gamut of speculative fiction genres. 2. Robert Silverberg's novel Hawksbill Station centers on the eponymous prehistoric penal colony, which is populated by prisoners sent back in time by a totalitarian United States. Punchats' 70 cover visualizes the station as an actual hawksbill. 3. Punchats' 1977 cover for Starshine. By Theodore Sturgeon. The artist's crisp acrylics bring clarity to the scene that belies its mystifying content. Chess in sci-fi. As a visual motif, chess represents brain power, control, and staying 3 steps ahead. Swap out the pieces for people like the guy who somehow rolled up his spacesuit sleeves on Frank Kelly Freas' 1973 cover for Star Master's Gambit by Gerald Klein, and the scene hints at characters locked in a battle of wits or as pawns in someone else's game. Maybe the pieces are entire planets, as in a 1978 Dean Ellis cover for Norman Spigrand's Agent of Chaos. The symbolism isn't subtle here, as the book is about a totalitarian order vying to define the nature of reality. Most sci-fi artists depicting the subject matter kept to the representational side, with the crispy detailed Ellis cover leading the way. Others used the board as a jumping-off point to toss in more surrealism, like the giant chess piece-shaped vehicles in front of an entire checkered city on one uncredited cover for Henry Cutter and C.L. Moore's Chessboard Planet, and other stories. Classical surrealists enjoyed the concept as well. Dali created a chess set in 1971 with his own fingers as models for these pieces. Sometimes, though, playing chess is just playing chess, give or take 3D holograms. For that, look no further than Frank Kelly Freitas' September 1979 cover for Galileo magazine, where two goofy aliens stroke their chins over a strategy game of chess's extraterrestrial equivalent. One is the aforementioned Dean Ellis cover. 2. Galileo magazine launched in 1976 and folded in 1980. Despite a high pedigree of contributors, including Bradbury, Joan de Vinge, and Brian Aldiss, Frank Kelly Freitas added his name to that list with his spirited September 1979 cover. 3. John Schoner's July 1966 cover for Analog magazine displays his painterly ability to make a fantastical scene appear lived in. The alien puzzle may not be Earth's chess, the cognitive challenge is at least as large. Judging from the head-scratching human in the background. 4. The aforementioned Freitas cover for Star Master's Gambit. Paul Kirshner's Dope Rider. Kirshner produced two surrealist comic strips across the 70s and 80s. His sly, wordless, six-panel heavy metal strip. The bus was about a middle-aged man failing to ride a bus without something impossible happening. And for the cannabis counterculture magazine High Times, there was Dope Rider. Dope Rider start a perpetually stoned cowboy skeleton stumbling through bizarre situations with a questionably earned sense of confidence. Landscapes would change completely between panels, lending the story a warped propulsion as deep as the bong hit you took 5 minutes before reading it. And the main character did indeed have dope rides, including but not limited to an armadillo-drawn cover dragon, several dead fish in a book, a giant scorpion, and a motorcycle on a tightrope. The pun-riddled, absurdly understated dialogue was part of the fun too, creating juxtapositions like the caption, "Dope Rider hastens to the rendezvous," over an image of the cowboy perched in a rocking chair on top of a thin spire of desert rock. Dope Rider dropped many a comb. Earth is the insane asylum of the universe. The changes they are a timing. But anyone tempted to call this strip dorm room stoner philosophy shouldn't be so quick to judge Kirshner, who was game enough to create his own self-parody comic titled Dopey Rider, and featuring mind melters like backwards spelled wrong is Gnidaflap. The comic ran sporadically in High Times from 1975 until 1986, and Kirshner revived it in 2014. It remains a gently nihilistic touchpoint for 1970s cannabis culture, though Kirshner himself was never really into drugs. 1. A full page from the January 1981 High Times installment. 2. The strip was 50% drugs, 50% Sergio Leone, as this 1978 panel hits. 3. This panel from Kirshner's self-parody comic appeared in the short-lived adult magazine Screw's March. 4. MC Escher's popularity in psychedelic culture surged in the 70s due to a 1971 Ballantine collection. This homage by Kirshner showed up in the January 1981 High Times. Douglas Chaffee produced science fiction and fantasy art across 5 decades, starting in the late 60s, with a selection of covers to magazines, including Galaxy, If, Worlds of Tomorrow, and Fantastic. Space exploration was a recurring theme in these works, with small teams of intrepid astronauts cautiously winding through color-drenched alien foliage or structures. The brashly red alien pods on Chaffee's May 1967 cover for Worlds of Tomorrow demonstrate his bold subjects and color choices. Although for color palettes you can't get more impressive than Galaxone from a 1980 Starlog profile of Chaffee's art, the blue and pink scene depicts an initial contact between 2 alien cultures. Chaffee stands out for his range, however his talents extended to realistic scientific illustrations, including one of the most widely read publications of all time. National Geographic's December 1967 issue featured his painting of a hypothetical Martian animal, for which Chaffee consulted with famed astronomer Carl Sagan. The alien, as Sagan wrote in that issue, is shielded from ultraviolet radiation by a glassy shell, while it gorges on mossy ground cover among plants with its cabbage-like tops. Out of college, Chaffee spent almost 20 years at IBM, serving as art director during the space race years, and after leaving went on to start his own design company. Contributed covers to Baen Books across the 90s and 2000s, and his career included art for NASA, military publications, Christian publications, and the gaming industry. For the latter, he created Dungeons & Dragons cover from the mid-80s, on BattleTech cards in '96, and Magic the Gathering in 2001. This If magazine cover ran with the December 1967 issue. Here a team of drugged into compliance space pilots commits one of their regular genocides, turning a city of a flaming circle of red, as Terry Carr put it in the short story of being depicted, City of Yesterday. 2. Chaffee's May 1967 Worlds of Tomorrow cover calls to mind the cryosleep pods humans might themselves use. This title was merged with If later in '67, despite its profitability, because the publisher preferred monthly rather than bi-monthly publications. 3. Galaxone ran in Starlog magazine's June 1980 issue. Norman Rockwell was on the jury of a fine art show that awarded Chaffee the write-up mentions. 4. This painting is one of multiple interior illustrations by Chaffee that accompanied the article Mars, written by Carl Sagan for National Geographic, December 1967. The Swift Rise and Swifter Fall of Galileo magazine. Throughout the 30s and 40s, the majority of science fiction magazines in the United States were pulps, a format with the same square-bound spine and dimensions as National Geographic, with cheap wood pulp pages designed to be disposable entertainment. In the ensuing years, World War II paper shortages spurred a shift to a thicker, shorter digest format. And by the 70s, SF Digest magazines were an undulating morass of renamed titles, merging publications, publisher acquisitions, and inconsistent monthly and bi-monthly schedule. SF was the shorthand used at time for print science fiction to distinguish it from the more sensational TV or movie sci-fi. Two of the biggest publications, the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction and Galaxy, had launched as digests in 49 and 50, respectively, while a third analog was early to change formats from pulp to digest in 43. Others were short-lived. Worlds of Tomorrow lasted from 63 until 67, when it merged with If magazine, which itself merged with Galaxy in 74. Then Galaxy shut down in 80 after being sold to Vincent McCaffrey, publisher of Galileo magazine. So how did Galileo, which ran for just 16 issues across the later half of the 70s, acquire one of the biggest magazines in the genre, only to shutter both of them? McCaffrey of the Boston, Massachusetts bookstore Avenue Victor Hugo had published the literary magazine Fiction since '72, centering each issue on a genre like westerns or SF. When employed Charles Ryan began pushing to convert the enterprise into an entirely SF title that combined fiction with articles, McCaffrey went along and made him the editor. In September 1976, Galileo sold out its initial 8,000 copy run. Local artist Tom Barber contributed the first 4 covers. As the magazine's reputation grew, the roster expanded to include John Schoner, Frank Kelly Freyas, Jeffrey Catherine Jones, Ron Miller, and Larry Blameyer, among a few others. Unlike the digest, Galileo was letter size, so artists had an entire 8.5 by 11-inch cover to fill, and their art could spill over to the back cover as well. Galileo published authors included Paul Anderson, Brian Aldiss, Larry Niven, and Harlan Ellison, the latter of whom McCaffrey fondly remembers visiting the bookstore to sit in the window writing short stories. Other bylines included Carl Sagan and the non-fiction debut of James P. Hogan. Galileo's sales shot up thanks largely to subscribers, north of 52,000 by the July 1978 issue, in contrast to the newsstands that the digest depended on. Then McCaffrey made, as he put it, a really stupid mistake. He planned an ambitious expansion into newsstands through a distribution deal that assumed 40% sell-through and went into debt in the process. But casual customers at newsstands weren't as interested as the subscriber fan base, and only 20% of the copies sold. And at the same time, mailing problems led to fewer subscription renewals. Galaxy magazine had itself faced subscriber cancellations in the late 70s, but the real problems were limited funds and editorial shakeups, both due to publisher mismanagement. The still profitable magazine had to be sold off, and McCaffrey acquired it in December 1979, just a month before learning of his debt to his distributors. He got one issue of Galaxy in 1980 before filing Chapter 11 that December. The circle of SF magazine life continued without Galileo or Galaxy. Analog and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, along with the 1977 upstart Asimov's Science Fiction, continue publishing issues to this day. Though sales numbers have dwindled across the board since roughly the mid-90s, Galileo's legacy, as biographer Michael Ashley wrote in his History of SF magazines, marked both the success story of the late 70s and its worst disaster. 1. Tom Barber sold dozens of speculative fiction covers to magazines and publishers, large and small, from 76 until the early 80s. His September 1976 cover for Galileo's first issue, featuring the publication's namesake, is among his earliest works. Two, acclaimed science fiction and astronomy author and artist Ron Miller contributed this January 1978 cover for the 6th issue. 3. Courtney Skinner's July 1979 cover was the first to hit newsstands as a part of Galileo's ill-fated distribution deal. 4. Tom Barber's April and July 77 covers to issues 3 and 4 feature two very different visored characters, a cool blue space explorer and the warmer colors of a vigilant, robotic alien. The 1970 cover for A. Van Vocht's Quest for the Future is an eye-catching example of artist Gary Veskupic's intricate and unmistakable 2D style. Its evenly spaced gobs of sea monster saliva and ocean waves are, much like the artwork's chunks, of red, green, and blue, intentionally abstract and unnatural. That's because Veskupic loves the surreal. Surrealism pops up even on his covers that mostly hew to the visuals of representational sci-fi art. Take his 1978 cover for The Best of Lester Del Rey, for instance. The humanoid robot is a classic sci-fi image, and Veskupic's choice to split her face in half to display empty sockets above the nude underside of a single eyeball is as evocative as anything Westworld could come up with. The heart in her abdominal cavity, however, is symbolic rather than anatomical and even has an arrow through it. Surrealism deals in symbolism frequently, but you wouldn't find a Cupid-pierced heart in any androids from detail-oriented giants of narrative cover art like Chris Foss or Michael Whelan. That particular cover is also garnished with hatching, a shading effect created with close-spaced parallel lines visible of the backside of the chest plate, and cross-hatching, the same technique with perpendicular lines added as seen on the arm and neck, another style choice that defines Veskupic's heavily lined work. Those bold yet precise lines of ink are as unapologetic as the content of the output Veskupic kept up for his whole career, both in the freelance sci-fi cover art career that spanned the late 60s, when Veskupic himself was in his early 20s, to the early 80s, as well as his prolific output at his core newspaper illustration job that lasted from the 70s until 2004. 1. Veskupic's 1970 dust jacket cover for Quest for the Future by A. Van Vocht carries a sense of whimsy despite or because of its undercurrent of danger. 2. Alfred Bester's The Demolished Man is a murder mystery in a future dystopian society with a class structure based on how adept one's telepathy skills are. Veskupic's surrealist 1978 cover hints at those oppressive rules with a big brain glaring at a man on a mission. 3. If the viewer looks closely, Veskupic's hatching techniques are visible on the 1977 cover for the Star Child trilogy by Frederick Pohl and Jack Williamson, even if he is using a typical subtle coloring. 4. Vizcupic's 1978 cover for the Best of Lester Del Rey packs a tiny Earth and other planetary spheres into the android's chest, adding even more surrealist detail to an artwork that already includes a heart with an arrow in it. Gary Vizcupic's TV Guide art. Gary Vizcupic had a healthy career in sci-fi covers, but to countless bored 70s kids combing their living rooms for reading material, his most indelible legacy rests with the very delible medium of newsprint. Vizcupic, a pen and ink master, produced myriad editorial illustrations during his tenure as the chief illustrator for Newsday, based on Long Island, New York. Each of his TV Guide illustrations ran alongside a brutally honest summary from fellow staffer and coiner of the phrase sit-throughable, John Cashman. Constrained to a few inches and a weekly publishing schedule, each artwork needed to punch above its symbolic weight. Vizcupic met the challenge with a surrealistic flair, a ribcage-shaped Earth for an NBC News report on global food shortages, a demonic tail curling out of a stroller for Rosemary's Baby, an ape/spaceman/fetus amalgamate for 2001 A Space Odyssey. Recurring themes included eyes, skulls, and merging different types of organic matter with each other. The art was often needlessly off-putting. One replaced a man's eyes with laughing mouths to illustrate a comedy special, but Vizcupic's enthusiasm comes. And in fact, that disconnect may have worked in his favor. What's more memorable, a random late 70s news report or its daringly succinct visual summary? Leo and Diane Dillon, and the third artist. Diane Sorber arrived in New York City from California in the summer of '53, joining the Parsons School of Design midway through the course. She was immediately intimidated by the three-dimensional realism of one painter in particular, her reserved and assiduous classmate Leo Dillon. Leo felt similarly, as Diane's impressive, flat graphic style was like no one else's, and he found it very unfair that such competition should join the class in the middle of the year. By their 1956 graduation, that rivalry had evolved into a much deeper partnership. They married in 1957, but the Dillons didn't stop competing. Instead, they turned their admiration for each other's work into a higher standard for each other, working so closely on each piece as impossible to tell who had contributed what. They might discuss their approach for a while before starting a piece, and either one could veto the other at any stage. This egalitarian collaboration wasn't easy and took years to iron out, but it produced work that neither one of them could have done alone. They called their combined efforts the third artist. The still coalescing science fiction paperback cover market of the 60s was a perfect fit for the Dillons, offering them the artistic freedom they craved. Their long partnership with author Harlan Ellison started in '59, when he commissioned them for a men's magazine he was editing, and they soon worked closely on science fiction covers. Starting in '67, the Dillons produced a 4-year run of surrealistic ace science fiction specials. While the sci-fi market shifted away from experimental covers in the early '70s, the two kept working in the genre for decades, particularly with Ellison. Leo and Diane love learning new techniques and styles, so their oeuvre is tough to sum up, but they frequently employed symbolism. expressionist influences, and bold neo-impressionistic colors to capture the themes of a book. They're best known for the children's book illustrations, particularly 1975's Why Mosquitoes Buzz in People's Ears by Verna Ardema and 77's Ashanti to Zulu, African Traditions by Margaret Musgrove, for which they won the Caldecott medals. But the Dylans and their third artist stand out within science fiction illustration as a stirring example of the avant-garde styles that thrived in the 60s. 1. The Dylans' lush work was used as the bottom illustration panel for a 1968 Ace Special paperback edition of Past Master by R.A. Lafferty. 2. A 1972 cover for Barefoot in the Head by Brian Aldiss shows off the Dylans' thick line work, which they lose in part because it allowed them to more easily pick up from where the other had left off. 3. Harlan Ellison loved the Dylans, saying in a 1981 book introduction that he and they are both used to hearing they're difficult to work with, as a result to their dedication to art. This 1967 cover for Harlan Ellison's Dangerous Visions takes the viewers inside an eyeball in one of the examples of the Dylans' innovative approach. So it looks like next time we have spaceship, vehicles, and mega structures. Especially after coming off of the last books, I'm really appreciating his writing. I like the framing that we've got, sort of these for the most part, these sort of profiles he's running on the different artists. I was worried that I was being overly negative on her writing, but with this as like a stark contrast, I feel like I feel more comfortable about that. But yeah, so I'm really enjoying this. I'm looking forward to hitting that next section tomorrow.